You can just see from the way he was holding his head even that he was thinking really hard. He wasn't reading a script, and he was trying to find a set of words to describe the outcome of this phone call and what the next steps would be. Putin is an extremely experienced negotiator, obviously deeply versed in international affairs. He knows how these things are done. And it was actually, for me, fascinating to watch him speak, because he was really having to work hard to find the right words. And I would say that he formulated it pretty well. But the one really interesting thing he said was that both sides, and we've never heard this before during the war, both sides have to be prepared to make compromises.
Let's talk now about the talks that have been going on now since at least this 11th of March. Do you think that President Trump's 2-hour telephone conversation with President Putin achieved very much, except to establish that Donald Trump is preparing perhaps to draw back, having said the conditions for a deal can only be negotiated by the warring parties? So basically saying it's up to Putin and Zelensky now. And Putin just seems to be doubling down on his maximalist demands.
Well, it certainly looks that way. And it seems that President Trump is a man in a hurry. He's getting frustrated by the lack of progress, having promised that he would be able to bring this war to a rapid end. He's discovered that reality is a little bit different, and ending wars, and particularly wars of this kind, are so complicated. This is a process that takes a great deal of time, and in fact, maybe even years. So he has achieved something, and that is he has created a situation where the two sides are talking again. And I don't think that should be completely underestimated. My view is that Putin is actually under more pressure than it appears from the outside. The Kremlin presents this narrative that the Russian army is advancing, Ukraine is about to be rolled over, and Russia will achieve its war goals. That really isn't the case. It is, of course, true that the Russian army is advancing, but it's advancing very slowly. Putin, at the same time, can see that there's a possibility that Europe will be able to keep Ukraine armed and perhaps even motivated to continue fighting, on the assumption that President Trump doesn't deliver another military aid package for Ukraine, and I think we can pretty much rule that out 100%. There might be some small things the US continues to do, and an important one would be continuing to offer intelligence support to Ukrainian army, but we don't even know if that's going to be provided. In which case, Putin can see an opportunity to move probably further into Ukraine. He can see Ukraine struggling to maintain the level of resistance that it's shown over the past more than 3 years. But it's not going to be a pushover. And he has got a number of pressures on his side. Firstly, the economy can withstand this level of sanctions pressure for probably another several years. But there are other bottlenecks. Defense industry is struggling to produce certain types of equipment that are being wiped out on the battlefield. If Putin were to go deeper into Ukraine, he'd almost certainly need to increase the size of the Russian army. And to do that, he would probably have to mobilize. And he doesn't want to mobilize. The last time he tried a partial mobilization, that was in September 2022, when the Ukrainians were in fact moving forward at some speed. And it really looked as though the Russian army was getting into trouble. He mobilized 300,000 reservists from across Russia, and about 1 million people in response left the country. Some of those later returned because they couldn't settle abroad. But it was a sign that Russian society, while it may not express disagreement with what Putin's doing in Ukraine or the decision to go to war, it certainly wasn't enthusiastic about it. So from what we understand, the Kremlin is really keen to avoid further mobilization. So there are a number of factors here. I mean, not least that the equipment stocks, some equipment stocks in the Russian army are probably going to run low. They've been burning through what was kept from the days of the Soviet Union, the old Soviet army's stocks, which would be simply put into storage. And we're talking about equipment here in some cases, from the 70s, 60s, and even 50s. that's being used on the battlefield at the moment. And that's not to say that it's useless, but a lot of it is simply being destroyed. And at some point, the Russian army may need to source that equipment from elsewhere, from neighboring Belarus, perhaps from North Korea, perhaps even indeed China. So there are some real challenges there. And I think that Putin probably has an interest in trying to bring this war to an end. So being offered this type of negotiation by Trump, and effectively being told that the United States really doesn't have a dog in this fight anymore, then that opens up real opportunities. So my view is that Putin is not sure of what he can achieve on the battlefield, because this is taking a long time. The Russian army is simply grinding forward, and it does have the strategic advantage just by virtue of numbers, of men and equipment. But it's a slow and painful process. And then, secondly, he's got to think about if he gets into let's put it this way: he can't be sure what he's going to achieve from the diplomatic process, because this again could take a great deal of time, and he's trying to frame that negotiation now by saying, let's talk about how this should look at the end of the day. How are we going to get to a peace agreement? What's it going to require? So he doesn't want to go straight for a ceasefire. He wants to try to get to a peace agreement eventually, or at least tie Ukraine into a negotiation on a peace agreement.
So in the light of everything you've said and those harsh realities that you say that are facing Putin, do you think that when he comes away from those talks from President Trump and says he would consider working on this memorandum on a possible future peace accord, I mean, that has been derided by a lot of commentators, saying he's just playing for more time to try and make more advances on the battlefield by still insisting on those maximalist objectives? Or do you actually think then, from what you're saying, that there might be a genuine desire to find a way out of this war?
Well, let's put it this way. The statement, Putin made a very careful statement after the 2-hour phone call with Trump on Monday. And he stood in front of the cameras, and you can just see from the way he was holding his head even that he was thinking really hard. He wasn't reading a script, and he was trying to find a set of words to describe the outcome of this phone call and what the next steps would be. Putin is an extremely experienced negotiator, obviously deeply versed in international affairs. He knows how these things are done. And it was actually, for me, fascinating to watch him speak, because he was really having to work hard to find the right words. And I would say that he formulated it pretty well. But the one really interesting thing he said was that both sides, and we've never heard this before during the war, both sides have to be prepared to make compromises. I'm slightly summarizing what he said. The sentence, that particular sentence, was a little bit more complicated, but that is what it comes down to. Both sides will have to make compromises. So, what are the compromises the Russians are thinking of making? Well, it might be something around territory. It might equally be an acceptance that Ukraine is going to have adequate armed forces that at least give it the impression that it remains a sovereign country, but don't give it the capacity, for example, to reconquer territory. Previously, the Russians have said, we want the complete demilitarization of Ukraine. And Ukraine can't have any relations, with foreign partners. It's going to be an absolutely neutral country in that sense. So there are, I think we face the prospect now of Putin keeping his options open on both fronts, diplomatically and then simply on the battlefield. But for him, I think there's absolutely no contradiction in negotiating and fighting at the same time. Because in his psychology, to gain advantage at the negotiation table, you need to be showing resolve, you need to be making progress in this other domain. So that's what I think we're going to see over the coming weeks, is probably the start of another Russian offensive in Donbass in southeastern Ukraine. And the Russians have been preparing for this for a good while. And it's quite possible that they will take a larger town. They've had their sights on a place called Pokrovsk for several months now, which still hasn't fallen. It's probably largely in ruins, but it's seen as a strategic hub that if the Russian army were to take it, it would put them in a much stronger position to advance further into Ukraine. So I think we're going to see this sort of curious mixture of things. And it's clear to me that Putin wants Trump to remain involved in this process. Simply not because Trump brings huge added value at this point. After all, he's sort of Trump's played two cards, which for what's given two cards effectively to Putin by saying, Ukraine is not going to join NATO because the US will stand in the way of that. And then secondly, the US believes that this conflict is going to have to be frozen. So there's no question of Ukraine recovering territory. So for Putin, those are, he's pocketed those concessions, and that makes life a lot easier for him. But at the end of the day, he wants to, I think, be able to rebuild a relationship with the United States. Trump is keen on doing this. And in Trump's view, this is all about business and everybody becomes wealthy in the process. And for Putin, it's in fact about reasserting Russia's influence in the world and pushing back that Western influence. So global affairs are simply not going to be dictated by Western countries, by the US and its allies. So if Trump gets frustrated with Putin and walks away, then many of those opportunities, perhaps, there's commercial opportunities, the negotiation around global governance, that maybe simply won't take place because Trump's attention is elsewhere. So I think he has to keep Trump in the game. And he's trying to do that. And the signal he was sending after that negotiation, that carefully formulated statement, to me, that was all evidence of the game that he's playing. Keep the Americans on board because they're useful at the moment.
So what do you expect President Putin's next move to be to keep Donald Trump from walking away beyond what you just said?
I think we'll see some movement on this memorandum that Putin has proposed negotiating with the Ukrainians. We'll see probably a bit more constructive Russian language around that. And the Russians, of course, will be testing at the same time to see, are the Europeans really going to form this, defense alliance that they're talking about, this coalition of the willing to support Ukraine? But more broadly, what is assuming that the US, and I think Putin has to assume this, that the US is progressively going to leave Europe and that NATO will become a different organization because it won't be backed by the US in the same way. But what in the end of the day are they going to be dealing with? And this, I think this is vitally important for the phase that will follow the conclusion of any sort of peace agreement. And let's differentiate here between a ceasefire and a peace agreement. A peace agreement is something that will take, I think, a very long time to negotiate and then implement. But a ceasefire is something that, in fact, could come relatively rapidly. But Putin doesn't want to start with a ceasefire. He's been down that road before in 2015 after the annexation of Crimea, and he thought that was the vehicle he could use to achieve his goals, and the Ukrainians actually obstructed it because the peace agreements at that time were written so badly. So he's coming at it from the other way. But he wants to know, I think, whether Europe is really going to rearm and whether Russia is going to have to now face Europe as a sort of significant factor on the continent, and one that can project not just soft power and economic power, as Europe has done successfully for decades, but can really amass hard power and indeed threaten to use it. So, for example, the announcement last week that Germany by 2032 might be spending up to 5% of its GDP on defense. This is nothing short of sensational. Given the Germans are probably hovering around 2% at the moment, but this is the biggest economy in Europe, it's the third biggest economy in the world. So, if Germany is going down that road and other countries, follow at least to some degree, then European defence might look very different.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.